Is Lisa on?
So let's get started with the webinar while people are joining. I'd like to welcome everyone to the webinar today, the Lunch and Learn. I'm Lisa Lawler, and I'm with the KristiLee Outreach and Training Committee. And we organize these Lunch and Learns, and we're excited to present this one because it's a topic that's a mystery to many of us. So the presentation today is about the engineer's role in Section 404 permitting with Mary Powell and KristiLee Halpin from the Mile High Flood District. They'll be teaching us how to.
Uh-oh.
I know, sorry about that. Let's get back to the introduction. They'll be teaching us how to improve the support that engineers can provide to environmental compliance specialists during the Section 404 permitting process. So as we're going through the presentation, please put your questions in the chat as they come up in the presentation. About our presenters, KristiLee Halpin joined the Mile District. Just a second. So sorry for that break. KristiLee Halpin joined the Mile High Flood District as an environmental specialist in 2023 to support the environmental services team. Prior to joining the Mile High Flood District, KristiLee provided technical expertise as a restoration ecologist and regulatory specialist on stream restoration projects. Mary Powell is the Mile High Flood District's environmental manager. She's acting as a central ecological and environmental compliance resource for the district and local government engineers, ecologists, and regulatory compliance specialists. Mary's excited to share her 30 years of environmental compliance experience with KristiLee members and others in our water resources community. All right, KristiLee and Mary, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Lisa. Appreciate the introduction. As always, we are happy to be here with our engineering colleagues and any others who might be watching today. Hopefully it's got some material that will either be a refresher or that will give you some aha moments. As Lisa said, as we go through the presentation, we'd be happy to answer any comments that you or questions that you put into the chat. We'll be trying to monitor those questions as they come in and answer them as we go along. So, and Lisa's going to help us if we seem to be not seeing questions. So if, be patient. If we don't get to your question right away, it probably just means we haven't seen it. So, yeah, so let's get started. First, yeah, clicks, yeah, you know, technology. Anyway, first, here's just some major items that we'd be going over with you today. And again, the intent is to have our engineering colleagues maybe have a better understanding of things that your environmental compliance specialists might ask of you. You know, hey, we need a wetland impact figure, or hey, we need your help kind of figuring out the fill below the ordinary high water mark, stuff like that. So ideally, this will build a better partnership between the engineering team and the environmental compliance folks. So, so let's just get going. Oh, anyway, we're here focused on the Section 404. We already kind of have that established. We're not going to be covering other types of environmental compliance, just mostly Section 404 today, since I think that's the thing that we most often encounter on our projects. And yeah, well, the first part, KristiLee is going to take over this piece about regulatory milestones in the design schedule.
Yeah, so I first wanted to just walk through the milestones that we typically see in a I guess, also a typical design schedule. So starting right off the bat with the project kickoff, as you may know, when we comply with the Clean Water Act, we also have to comply with other federal acts. This is typically the Endangered Species Act, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and also the National Historic Preservation Act. One good way to comply with all of these acts when we first start a project is just to get out and have the consultant identify what regulated resources are even within the project site. By identifying these, you as the engineer can then help avoid and possibly minimize any impacts that you might have to these sensitive resources. And also, if you have an idea of what is on the site, it gives the design team more predictability of the obstacles that you may face as part of the permitting process. Moving on to conceptual design, there's a few pieces of information that consultants need before they can fully determine and feel confident about what the permit is that you are going to need for the project. So in order to determine what that permit is, the pieces of information we need are the project purpose and need and the anticipated impacts to waters of the US or WOTUS. And so your role in this step of the process could be just talking with the consultant about what the need is that we have on the site and how the various permit options might fit based on the project purpose. And also you could help with it if you had the delineation from the consultant, you could give a preliminary impact calculation, which again helps determine if we're in the nationwide permit territory, regional general permit territory, or if we have substantial impacts and we're in an individual permit situation. At 30% design, we really should have a good idea of where we're going when it comes to the 404 permit. Depending on the scale and extent of the project, we may want to meet with the Army Corps of Engineers. This would be a pre-application meeting with the Army Corps. And the intent of this meeting is really to outline the project for the Army Corps and to give them an opportunity to express any concerns that they might have with the permitting approach that the consultant has developed. If you do have this meeting on your project and you are participating during that meeting, the engineer's role that I see is really to help fill in some information on the project need, but then also going through and describing what the proposed design is. Since how you have designed it, you're really the best person to speak to what the design elements are and how they address the need of the project.
I'm gonna add a little anecdote here.
Okay.
And say I absolutely the pre-application meeting is, I think, super important, as KristiLee said, for particularly larger projects or more complicated ones, because it's a great way to introduce the Corps. That way you're not surprised when you submit something, you know what the response is going to be. But I will say sometimes in the past, I've had some meetings where the engineers, you really do want to have a conversation with your environmental consultants before the pre-application meeting, because your consultant or your compliance specialist will provide you with some tips on phrases to avoid, or we're trying to tell a story to the Corps that fits within their regulatory parameters. And sometimes I remember one meeting, this bless his heart, this engineer kept trying to talk to the Corps, and it was just going sideways because they weren't hitting the mark together. And I said, why don't you go stand over there for a while and we'll get this figured out. So anyway, it was just kind of a humorous anecdote. And that was Pat Doherty with the City of Arvada back in the day. He always teased me about it afterward, having told him to go in the corner. But anyway, it's a great meeting, but it's also, you want to prep for it so that you can stay away from landmines.
Yes, I would completely agree. And then one other component of this meeting that would be a great discussion point for the whole project team is if your project is going to require use of the Colorado Stream Quantification Tool. This meeting is at least, when you're dipping your toes in the water when it comes to the discussion with the Corps about what parameters and metrics you might be collecting data on. And, if you have any questions about the methodology for the CSQT, or you have any other special concerns with regard to your project and that data collection protocol.
Do you want to answer? There's a quick question.
Sure. How large does a project need to be to request a pre-application meeting? That's a good question.
Mhm.
I think it depends. If you're looking like you're going to be in an individual permit situation, so typically that's when impacts to wetlands and waters of the U.S. would exceed all thresholds set by the nationwide and regional general permits. So that's somewhere between a half an acre and, well, if you get to use our RGP7 for a project, it's up to potentially 5 acres of impacts.
Yeah.
Kind of, like I said, it depends. But also if there's a question about what the purpose is of the project, I'd say. There are some nationwide permits that might be a good idea to meet with the Corps. For example, the nationwide permit 27, that one seems to be a really tricky one to get from the Corps. So I wouldn't want to just submit cold turkey to the Corps without talking to them about potentially using that nationwide permit, because they're very sensitive to issuing authorization for that particular permit.
Yep. I know for me, one criterion that I used was if I'm not sure how they're going to respond to a submittal, if I'm putting in a request for authorization, if I'm not sure they're going to agree with me, then I want to have a meeting. So if it's like a recreation trail crossing, I know that's going to go under nationwide permit 14 or an outfall, little slam dunky stuff, no problem to just submit because you know what they're going to come back with.
Yep.
So
we have one more question.
Yeah, and I'll let you answer that.
Are there
Don't
specific
go into too much detail.
Are there specific guidelines or criteria for determining whether a CSQT is required? Well, right now, at least in all of the regulations, the language that we have, it's 1/10 of an acre of permanent impact to an open water. If you have that, you're potentially looking at the need for CSQT. So it's pretty small.
Tiny.
Pretty small.
Mm-hmm. Is it a 10th or 300ths?
Oh wait, no, maybe I misspoke. It is 0.03.
0.03
Sorry
acre
about that.
of impacts. Permanent 0.03.
0.03.
Not 3/10, 300ths. It's about the size of my desk. 300ths of an acre when you need CSQT.
Yep. Okay.
All right.
Moving on to 60%, and then I kind of just roped in all of the rest of final design into this slide. So at this point, we know where we're going with the 404 permit application. We should be submitting once we get to 60% design most of the time. I mean, you could potentially hold out until you get to final design. Really depends on the project, but 60% is usually a good safe time to submit. And your role in this stage of the process is really, if you participated in the CSQT data collection, it would be finalizing all of your scoring and all of the data forms that go into the CSQT package. I also strongly recommend you review the 404 permit application, and particularly the description of the proposed activity section, because this is where the consultant has outlined everything, all of the design elements that you are showing in the design drawings. So it's good to just double check that and make sure it's accurate. And then after everything is submitted and you receive an authorization, and we're kind of pushing forward to that, 90% or 100% design phase, you'll want to confirm that whatever waters of the U.S. impacts you submitted as part of the 404 permit application are still consistent at the tail end of the design. So basically what I'm saying is, if your limits of construction have changed at all, plus or minus, you should just be verifying what those impacts are, because it will then potentially, if they have changed, you may need to submit for a permit amendment. It not only impacts the permit itself, but also the proposed mitigation as well as the CSQT. So it's really good to do a final check on those calculations.
Yeah, and I'll add, I think this is a critical act.
Do you want me to go sectioner?
Pardon?
She's
Whoop.
I
think someone, if everybody could mute, that'd be great. What I was going to say is it's super important to maintain that conversation with the whole team. Obviously, if there's changes to the design, the environmental. Okay. Are we unmuted? Hopefully.
Yes,
I think we got muted with everybody. Stop that. Okay. Sorry, we keep getting muted. Communicate. That's my main point. If the footprint changes, or if the materials change, or if you go from like a grouted boulder drop structure to a sculpted concrete drop structure, that's a change that should at least be disclosed to the Corps to see if they want to change their, their records or something. So absolutely keep that conversation going. There's nothing worse, having experienced it, getting something permitted and then having the design team at the last minute say, oh, and yeah, we moved all these drop structures around. This is still the same number, but we moved them everywhere. Like, oh, okay, because that's a big deal. So keep everybody up to date. That's what I got on that. So, can I do this?
Yeah, go for it.
Go for it. Okay. All right. Determining the project purpose and need. This conversation really is focused on projects specifically that would require an individual permit, a project that's not covered by either a nationwide permit or by our regional general permit. So these tend to be larger projects, although frankly, well, no, I guess an RGP would cover that now. But if you're not doing a mile-high flood district drop structure, even just a drop structure can sometimes need an individual permit. There's no nationwide permit that authorizes a drop structure, which seems kind of crazy. But so anyway, but I would like to say, I think it's important for the design team to have this conversation about the purpose and need for the project at the beginning, even before you know what the permitting avenue might be. Because I think it's very helpful to clarify what exactly we're doing with the project, what problems are we trying to solve. This conversation really leads to, I think, a better alternatives analysis. There may be some creative ways to address the issue that you uncover in the determining the project purpose and need. You can have a conversation like, oh, well, let's think about it this way. And you might realize there's a different alternative that may have better results that you didn't think about initially coming in, because we all have our preconceptions in our head about what's the right solution. So I think sometimes backing off and really having that explicit conversation can be very useful. So, purpose and need statement. The purpose is really what problem is being solved. It's the why of the project. For example, and I'm going to use 3 examples through this part of the presentation. So the purpose of a project, if you're doing residential development, well, you're meeting the demand for housing. That's the purpose of the project. Maybe it's a flood risk mitigation project. There's some homes being flooded. The purpose is to mitigate that flood risk. Or your purpose is stream restoration. You're trying to restore the stream to some condition. So those are some examples of just the project purpose, the why. What are we out here doing? The need is really about what is making the project, well, this is sort of redundant, what's making the project necessary? Why is it needed? And this is typically more about the specific problem that is being addressed. So for instance, on the top one, the meeting demand for housing, well, it's needed, the project proponent, remember this is the idea of the project proponent, is out there to make money on a housing development. They're not doing it just because there's unmet housing needs. So that goes into some of the thinking on projects for developers, which makes it hard for them to get permits, to be honest. Another, for instance, the need is there's homes that are flooded during a 10-year event. So we're going to have to do the flood risk mitigation because of this need. Finally, the stream restoration project, why is it needed? Because there's increased runoff that's led to channel incision. Okay. What important thing about purpose and need is it is not a description of what is being done. A lot of times I'll see a project purpose and need statement that talks about, well, we're going to go in and we're going to, put in a new culvert and we're going to have 5 riffle structures and this, that, and the other thing. And that's just describing what you're going to do or want to do, which is really an alternative. That's an alternative of how you are meeting the need, how you're addressing that need. So it's definitely not just a big description of what's being proposed. No questions yet. Okay. All right. All right. So maybe just a couple of more examples on purpose and need statement. The need can typically be addressed or demonstrated by the facts and data that sort of bring it to your attention in the first place. So for instance, for the housing development, well, it's needed because we've had population growth or home prices have increased, which shows that there's high demand, or the number of days on the market is down. And so we know homes are getting snapped up. That's an indication of need for housing. In the flood example, well, maybe the existing culvert capacity is 200 CFS, and that 10-year event that floods homes is a 500 CFS event. So it clearly is demonstrating why the culvert's the problem. And then finally, with the stream restoration, it can be documented with depth of incision, the bank height ratio, sediment deposition, etc. So again, the purpose and need statement should be supported by facts that you can demonstrate it's actually necessary. And you want to make sure, this kind of speaks to the previous point about you're not describing what you want to do. So the purpose and need statement can't really be written so narrowly that the only alternative that you can find to fix the issue is what you want to do. You really want to be focused on the overall problem, the overall need for the project, not just one way to fix that problem. It's a subtlety, but it's pretty important. And here's the big kick that takes us to the next section, I think, is the project purpose and need helps you develop alternatives for consideration for the permit application and what the Corps looks at. And it helps decide, well, what's really a practicable alternative, and I'll address that. But as always, one thing that's very important is make sure you're collaborating with your compliance specialist. They'll be able to ask you questions and work with you on the purpose and need statement. I don't know if you've ever worked on some projects, but occasionally be like, well, no, this isn't a flood. We're not trying to reduce the floodplain. We're restoring the creek channel, and it just happens to bring the floodplain in. So you do want to have some subtleties, and your compliance specialist can help you with that for sure. No questions?
No questions.
No questions. Okay. It's because you're like, what is she talking about? Again, this is just to kind of help you understand a little bit better some of the things that the compliance person is doing and that they'll ask for your assistance with. And it's just to maybe help you understand why they're saying, no, don't talk about, increasing developable land. We don't want to talk about that.
We do have a question.
We do have a question.
Are alternatives always required?
That's a good question. I'll try to not use my usual response. Whether you need alternatives will vary by project. So you definitely always need alternatives when you are doing an individual permit application, and I'll talk about that a little bit more detail. When you're doing a nationwide permit authorization request, you typically do not need a full alternatives analysis. Although, as KristiLee will discuss further, you may need to be talking about some alternatives analysis as ways to minimize or avoid, well, if you're going for authorization, you couldn't avoid it, but to minimize your impacts, you may want to talk about some project alternatives, but you don't necessarily need to bring those forward to the Corps of Engineers. So that's a good question.
Mary, if I may.
You may.
I don't know if you're going to get to this, so
Okay.
sorry if I preempt it.
No worries.
I just want to make a quick statement that says the alternatives analysis in light of 404 compliance is not equitable with the set of alternatives that are developed for the project, always.
Yes, yeah. What KristiLee is getting at, I think I'll tease apart in some of these further slides.
Okay.
And again, it's a subtlety. It's like the purpose and need statement isn't a description of what you're going to do. The alternatives analysis isn't always a description of, oh, we looked at this many drop structure types or this location of drop structures, or, there's design alternative analysis versus what we're talking about here from a bigger picture alternatives analysis. And let me get into that a little bit. So one thing that the Corps in particular must do by law, by regulation, by rule, is they can only permit the least environmentally damaging practicable alternative that meets the project purpose and need. Whew. That's shortened by the phrase LEDPA, least environmentally damaging practicable alternative. And obviously the fact that it has to meet the project purpose and need clearly shows that link to having a good purpose and need statement that helps you develop alternatives that hopefully show your project in a favorable light. Because again, we're telling the story here. We're not trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes or trying to, be withholding, but we do want to put our project forward in the best way we can. And a good purpose and need statement will help with that. Because again, the Corps can only give you a permit if you can demonstrate that you've done everything you can to avoid impacts to wetlands. If you can't avoid them, that you've done everything practicable to minimize them. So, and practicable, they have some very specific definitions of what that means, and it's generally in light of cost, logistics, and technology. Cost and technology, pretty simple. Logistics would be something like you'll never get that zoned for whatever you want to do, or there's a highway coming through and you can't go under the highway or something. It's just something that's an impediment to actually doing the project. Maybe pie in the sky. Well, yeah, if we had all the time and money in the world, we could do it, but that's not practicable. So
yeah, we have a question.
Oh, we do.
So alternatives that cause environmental destruction will help our case?
Well, that is a really good question. I like how it's phrased. Well, we certainly don't want to, again, we're not trying to deceive anybody, but it's not uncommon to have alternatives that have higher impacts than what we end up wanting to do, right? If we're going through the process in a good faith effort, yeah, there's going to be some alternatives, practicable alternatives, maybe that have more impacts. Maybe instead of you go into a project, maybe a stream project, and you think, well, we're going to just stabilize this whole reach from point A to point B. That's maximum impact, right? It might be great for what you want to do, but then maybe if you do more thinking through the project, you might identify some select places that need the work rather than the whole thing. So you can compare. Those are two alternatives you could compare in that case. It's a pretty limited case, but yeah, you want to point out there's some alternatives that are, I call it the maximum environmentally damaging practicable alternative. So yeah, sometimes there's the LEDPA and sometimes there's the MAXPA. Hopefully that gets it. So, and again, I talked about the showing you can't avoid wetlands. That's a big jump. And part of that again comes to providing a reasonable range of alternatives for your project. If you're doing an individual permit, the Corps will always ask you for a no action alternative. Now, there's two types of no action alternatives. One is you just don't do a project. You just, all right, the way we can avoid impacts to wetlands is just we're not doing the project. However, there are often alternatives that you can do to meet the project purpose and need that don't require a federal action, and that's oftentimes what the Corps is looking for. They are looking for a no federal action, no permit required alternative. An example would be, well, here, look, I've got some examples right below. And sometimes it's not all that obvious, but you have to go through that thought process. For example, if we're talking about that culvert that's undersized, or even if we're talking about the, actually this is probably more relevant, even if we're talking about the stream restoration project, if the stressor on the stream is the change in hydrology, you have increased runoff, then some of the less obvious alternatives to address the change in hydrology is to do something to modify the hydrology, which maybe it's off-site detention. If you can build enough detention, you shave those peak flows, it's full spectrum. So you can change the hydrology without impacting the stream, which maybe would be enough to allow the stream to fix itself. On the bridge example, maybe you could, instead of replacing the bridge and impacting the stream, maybe you can put some additional culverts in the uplands, in the floodplain, in the overbank area to increase capacity. Because it's a capacity problem of the bridge. It's not a stream problem, right? So you have to kind of reverse the thinking. How can we increase capacity without touching the stream? Another way, for instance, sometimes to change the floodplain is, again, it's not a stream problem per se, it's a floodplain capacity problem. So what if we just pull back the overbanks, take out a lot of fill, and then we lower the floodplain that way instead of redoing the whole channel. So anyway, those are some examples of alternatives that might be no permit required, but you're still doing the project. But in that case, the Corps is like, sweet, have at it, you're on your way. So we did talk about those cases a little bit where you have alternatives that you really do need to get into the stream. Say you've demonstrated that, you've been able to show that there's no practicable alternative to getting into the creek or your wetland, whatever you are. This is where some of the design alternatives come in that KristiLee alluded to earlier, where you can really talk about avoidance and minimization.
Yep. So we're going to just start off with a little bit of light reading. No, I'm not going to read this to you, but this is language pulled from the Code of Federal Regulations for processing of permits, and then also there's some language in the part for compensatory mitigation for losses of aquatic resources. And really what the regulations are getting at when it comes to avoiding and minimizing impacts to wetlands and other waters of the U.S., we have to take a hierarchical approach where we first avoid if we can. If we can't avoid, then we minimize to maximum extent practicable. And if unfortunately we can't minimize our impacts to zero, then the only leftover option is to mitigate. And so I want to just Mary actually kind of already went over this, but I'm just going to give a quick graphic example of it, where this is a project that we worked on up in Todd Creek. And basically the whole reach was initially slated for improvements because of an upcoming development. So they wanted to do a stream improvements project in anticipation of that upcoming development. We identified in the delineation that there was a really large wetland on site. And after talking about it with the design engineer and assessing the condition in the field, really we determined that this particular wetland area, which is shown in green on this figure, was stable, and that we didn't really need to do anything in this area. So we avoided it. And the impacts that we ended up coming up with are just those shown in the red hatch here. But this was really helpful because as part of the application, the Section 404 application, we need to talk specifically about how we avoid and minimize impacts to aquatic resources. And in this particular case, we were able to demonstrate and say, based on our site assessment, this area is stable, and we were able to avoid impacting these wetlands.
Yep. And we're not trying to, please don't think we're questioning your design when your environmental compliance person is kind of asking questions or, well, why does it have to be this way? Or can you do this or that? It's really trying to get at, hey, can we avoid it? Can we minimize? Because not always when you're looking at a piece of paper, it's not always obvious that, maybe we can avoid this. So again, we want to get away from those preconceived notions of what the project might look like and really focus on what the problem is that we're solving, and are there less impactful ways to solve the problem. So that's we're just hoping to have a conversation with you about that.
Yep.
Yep.
And there are benefits from a 404 perspective. Of course, we have to demonstrate to the Corps that we did avoid and minimize, and we have to include that in the actual permit application. So that's an obvious benefit. But some other benefits that might not be as obvious is that if we can reduce impacts down, we might be able to fit in a nationwide or regional general permit, as opposed to having to rely on the individual permit option, which is what that Todd Creek project was able to avoid. We were able to avoid the individual permit by reducing that wetland impact and get it authorized under a regional general permit. The individual permit process is much more complicated. There's a lot more components that are needed, so that's definitely a big win. And also, in addition to that, you can potentially avoid, if you can fully avoid wetlands, but avoid or reduce your compensatory mitigation requirements. These days, the Army Corps seems to be in the light of, we have to purchase credits from an approved mitigation bank to compensate for any wetland impacts, and they're very costly, so they can be very expensive to the project. So if we can reduce that cost and the compensatory mitigation requirements, it's definitely a benefit.
Yeah. We do have a comment, but I will make one comment, because those of you who might have worked with me for a while over the years have heard me say, don't design your project to the permit. And by that, when I say that, I'm talking about, you don't want to compromise your project. You don't want to not fully meet your project purpose and need in order to get a nationwide or just avoid an individual permit. But what KristiLee is talking about here is, how can we avoid and minimize and still have the project that we want? You may not be able to avoid the IP. And it's a balancing act. And if you can do it with some thought and some creativity, awesome. Then let's not get an IP. But sometimes you just have to, bite the bullet and get the IP. Yep. So do you want to address the question?
Sure. Are all wetland types treated equally when it comes to 404 permitting?
Mm-hmm.
I'd say more or less. What do you think, Mary?
I would say,
well,
more or less.
For the area that we work in, the Denver metropolitan area, I'd say yeah. Yeah,
but KristiLee is thinking of something like a fen up in the mountains, or a very pristine high mountain meadow or something. Those get a little special look. See, we don't really have much that warrants a special look from the regulatory perspective. So a cattail wetland gets all the same love as a highly diverse, herbaceous, native wetland. And it doesn't matter whether it's man-made or natural. If it's wetlands that have formed because you didn't hit the grade on that culvert, well, that's, and it's on a stream and it's backing up water, so now you have wetlands. That doesn't matter. They're all, it's a wetland is a wetland is a wetland, and you've got to deal with it. Now, I will say, when you get to mitigation, there are some differences with those functional, high quality wetland that's impacted might require a higher ratio of mitigation above and beyond the 1-to-1.
Right.
Whereas a cattail wetland, maybe you can get closer to a 1-to-1 ratio on that mitigation.
Yep.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. Good question.
Okay, we're going to move on, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about preparing figures for the Army Corps of Engineers submittal. The first one that I want to discuss is a figure that typically is always submitted when it comes to a 404 permit application, and it is the figure that shows impacts to wetlands and other waters of the U.S. I just have a couple of examples that I wanted to show and point out what I like about them in particular. So number one, we need to include the actual resources on the figure. So showing the wetlands and the waters, their extent, that's a given. And then based on the design, what is the footprint of impact? This particular figure breaks out the impacts as temporary and permanent, and it also breaks out the impacts for wetlands and waters. So there's really 4 types of impacts that are shown on here. This is really important when it comes to especially nationwide permit and maybe regional general permit submittals, to have that clear distinction of in the impact acreage for each of the water types. The next one that I wanted to show doesn't actually break those out graphically. It does show wetlands and waters and what's impacted, but this particular figure went ahead and included 2 tables that document the wetland impact and have it broken out by permanent and temporary. And I know you can't see that very well, but
let's see, we get the little laser pointer. Laser pointer right down here.
Yeah.
Look at
Yep.
that.
So it does have both of the resource types and whether or not they're permanent or temporary impact. And
Oh.
the last one that I wanted to show on this, this particular project is a bit more complicated. There was a pretty substantial stream realignment, and so the engineer did include the delineation on their design set, and it just really clearly shows what's going to be impacted as part of this project. It's kind of hidden in the back, but this one also has those tables that differentiate the types of impacts by each resource.
I would definitely say a combination of graphic representation and tabular is very helpful for the core to really see what is going on, for sure. Yeah.
And now I'm going to kind of go into a few of the less commonly submitted figures. This first one that I wanted to talk about is the floodplain impact figure. I have some more language from the Code of Federal Regulations showing here. But basically, Mary was getting to this earlier. We have Executive Order 11988 that the President of the United States issued that more or less says that we can't get into the floodplain to increase developable land when we have an alternative that exists outside that floodplain. So we really have to reduce and avoid impacts to the floodplain where possible. And the Corps starts to question that when we have projects that may have a substantial development going in adjacent to the corridor, and maybe this project, the development kind of is going hand in hand with the stream improvements because we're preparing the corridor for the increased runoff that is anticipated as a result of that development. So this particular project was on First Creek, and the Corps wanted to see pre-project floodplain mapping and post-project floodplain mapping and wanted us to compare the two, which is what this figure shows. The orange lines that are on here are the pre-project, and the kind of aqua color is the post-project. But in addition to just the mapping, the Corps did want to see a surface area calculation of the change in floodplain in order for us to demonstrate that we were not basically maximizing developable land as a result of this project. Okay. Another lesser submitted figure to the Corps is the site, well, a figure that could correspond to the site protection instrument. For those that don't know, the site protection instrument is a component of the compensatory mitigation plan, and it's basically a legal document that establishes protections for the compensatory wetland mitigation site. And so we found that providing a figure that corresponds to this legal document just really shows the exact extent of what we are protecting as part of the mitigation plan. So this, I'm going back to First Creek, the same project. We have a blue hatching that shows the actual area protected, which is not only the proposed mitigation wetlands as shown in green, but also a buffer so that there is just, I guess, a buffer on the wetlands for some additional protection. This particular project also has some infrastructure that has been installed prior to the project, but also that we were installing as part of the project. And so we have called out a few areas that are to be excluded from the site protection. And the reason that we wanted to do that is because if that infrastructure needed any kind of maintenance or full replacement down the line, if it was basically lumped in with the site protection area, we wouldn't be able to do any of that kind of work in the future. So designating that areas to exclude is really critical. And then I just have three figures that I'm going to quickly show on the Colorado Stream Quantification Tool. These are figures that we've had feedback from the Corps that they really like. So if you happen to find yourself in a situation where you're doing CSQT on a project, you might consider including some of these elements on the figures that you submit. So this first one is just kind of a high-level overview of the CSQT. For this particular reach, we have not only the reach length, but also the representative subreaches, and this particular figure does show the representative ripples. And then a close-up, it just shows more of the elements that we actually collect data on for the various metrics that are collected as part of the CSQT. So where the riparian vegetation plots are, the geomorphic pools, etc. And then they also really like a very detailed figure that shows not only the features in the CSQT, but also what those corresponding measurements are. And this just really helps them when they're looking at all of the data forms to see exactly what the data is showing when they're comparing it to the figure. I think we have a question.
Yep, it's about, you read the question and I'll back
Okay.
up to the figure.
In the example you just presented, were you required to achieve a no net rise, or was it acceptable to simply not show an increase in flood inundation area along the study reach? That's a good question.
Yeah, we were not trying to show a no net rise, because you could change the shape of the floodplain and make land more developable with a no net rise. I would suspect somehow. Pardon me for I'm not a H&H expert, but I think you could probably do that. But so no, they're really more interested in the lateral extent and even how if the floodplain is moving from one place to another, like does it moving off of this area suddenly make more contiguous area that's better suited for development? So that can be something they're looking at. In this particular example, they were absolutely looking for similarities in surface area, and that we weren't reconfiguring the stream or something in a way that would suddenly increase, again, that continuity of development that would make it more desirable. This was for a big box development, so you can imagine the bigger the chunk of property that's intact and contiguous, the better it is. So those are some of the issues they're looking at.
And someone chimed in that FEMA will evaluate the no rise, and thank you for that.
Yep, FEMA, just to be clear, the Corps and FEMA, nothing, there's virtually no interaction with that at all. You can have the Corps give you a permit with no problem, and FEMA say, nope, we're not doing it, and vice versa. FEMA can say, yep, looks great to us, and the Corps will be like, well, we're not letting you do it. So for sure, they are not tied together much at all. Yeah, good questions. Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of our figures.
Yeah. Let's see, we've got about
12
minutes. I think we can get through this pretty quickly. So I've included this little section here just with a few phrases that I think sometimes people, what exactly does that mean? Or it just seems to come up pretty often, or people are like, what? That can't be what it really means. It's like, well, yeah, sorry, but it is, because that's just the way the regulations are written. So, and I strongly believe this, like in that instance with Pat Doherty, when I pushed him off to the side, your environmental compliance specialist is really oftentimes a translator between the regulator and then the design team, or the project proponents. So you really want to let those specialists work their magic, and again, hopefully the team has been prepped before any meetings so that you don't unintentionally upset the apple cart with saying something that maybe it's, again, we're not deceiving anybody, but there are some things that you don't need to disclose every little thing. And so your compliance specialist will help with that to make sure you are walking the right line between transparency and, they just don't need to know that. There's some things they don't need to know. So anyway, going through quickly.
Mary, sorry, we had someone chime in. Things to avoid saying. Are you going to get to some of those?
Oh, well, I don't know. Because it's so project specific, but I would say generally you want to avoid saying something unless it's true and there's just no two ways around it. You don't want to say, well, we're trying to increase developable land. That's
a biggie.
That's a big one. Now, if you're a developer and that's what you're doing, then it's going to be pretty obvious. Trying to think of other situations where I've been like, no, that's not what they mean. Gosh, I can't think of one. But you'll know it when your environmental compliance specialist says, no, what they meant was this. So I wish I could think of more. Anyway, so one thing that kind of gets people sometimes is, the Corps regulates the discharge of dredged and fill material. And there's some question sometime about, well, what does fill material mean? Well, it means pretty much anything. So for instance, I've got the dropping a piece of large woody debris in the stream. Maybe this is to improve habitat, but this is considered discharge of fill material. Obviously, dumping a boulder into the creek is discharge of fill material. One thing that people don't always think about is, and this is an exaggerated example, but that's just moving dirt around within the stream bed. You know, say you're just, I don't know, dozing around and you're trying to do a little sculpting. You're not bringing anything in, you're not adding anything, but you're just moving it around. This is still considered discharge of fill material. So it's a little confusing to me, I think, because even somebody, a nice operator with a bucket, you know, sometimes they want to make things nice and smooth with their bucket and they move stuff around. Well, that's discharge of fill material. And they need to be careful about it if that's not within the project limits. So just a little subtlety there that I think is worth talking about. Another thing you'll hear sometimes your compliance specialist will ask you about is helping to calculate the volume of fill below the ordinary high water mark. And as a general practice, I would recommend that the compliance specialists do that rather than the engineering team, because again, there are some subtleties, and what I find based on my personal experience is that oftentimes the engineers tend to overestimate the amount of fill that's calculated. But so the blue line here is the ordinary high water mark. This brownish greenish line is the existing grade, and then obviously this is showing the soil lifts going in to stabilize the bank and rebuild it out. So the fill below the ordinary high water mark is this column below ground that goes to infinity that encompasses, you know, here's the riprap toe to stabilize the lifts, and then some of the lifts, not all of the lifts, are within this column. So it takes a little practice to get it right, but we do ask sometimes for some help with that ordinary fill below the ordinary high water mark. So another thing that people ask questions about a lot is temporary impacts. What does that mean? You know, we're putting wetlands back right here. Well, sometimes those wetlands are either a foot lower or a foot higher, depending on the project. And if there's any change in grade, those are not considered temporary impacts. They're sort of in place mitigation because maybe you're putting wetlands back right in the same horizontal, but it's not the same vertical. So those are permanent impacts. Again, temporary impacts, elevation must be returned to pre-existing grade. Some examples of temporary impacts would be access across streams. You put the culvert in with some fill over it. You take it out when you're done. Water diversion oftentimes has temporary impacts. Again, you take it out or you put it all back the way it was. Utility line installation typically has temporary impacts if you do it right. So these are all things that are temporary, but most of what we do in our stream projects, a lot of it is not temporary. Oh, and sediment control measures, like sediment.
Check dam?
A check dam, thank you. I could not think of that word earlier. I would have put check dam, but I couldn't think of it. So the key thing on this is it must be removed. And then the final one I have, and this is more just an ism of mine. A lot of times it sounds like we get a permit for every single project that we do. And it's shorthand, but I think it's worth realizing the distinction that the only time a project gets a permit is if it gets an individual permit. It is authorized under an individual permit. Our other projects are authorized under existing standing permits that we're working under. So nationwide permits, obviously, they're out there right now. And what you do is confirm that you are authorized to work under that permit according to all those different conditions. So you will never get yourself a nationwide permit. You'll be authorized to work under a nationwide permit. Same with the RGP. The permit is there. You don't get one for your project. You get authorized to work under that permit. So again, it's a subtlety, but I think it's worth noting. And it'll make you sound really super knowledgeable if you say, well, now actually, we're just getting authorization instead of a permit. Must be the end of the presentation. All right, and we just have a few, but yeah, no more questions yet.
No more questions.
I'm just throwing this slide up to do some filler while we wait to see if you have any more questions. But some compliance tips. These are always oldies but goodies. Make sure you're coordinating with your agencies sooner than later. You really don't do yourself any favors if you wait. If in doubt, find out. That is what you need to do.
Do you want me to read them as they come up?
Sure.
Okay.
Because I can't see.
Do you have suggested resources to determine potential applicability of 404 permitting at the conceptual level prior to hiring an environmental consultant or compliance specialist?
Boy. If in doubt, find out. If you think there's a wet spot on your site, you'd better get somebody who knows the answer to that question, I would say. I mean, I hate to say that, but the subtleties and the complexities are, if you see a cattail, it's just really gonna, I always say it, but it depends, because you could have a tiny cattail wetland and it may or may not be jurisdictional. And depending on what you do, even though it's tiny, you may still need an individual permit, right? Or if it's really huge and big, sometimes you don't need, you can do the work, you can be authorized under a nationwide permit. So the permitting approach is, I wouldn't try to guess it if you're not pretty knowledgeable with it. I'm sorry to say that, but feel free to call. I love, people call me all the time. Oh, I have this wetland and I don't know. And, I can make a educated guess, but most consultants are going to be happy to sort of chat with you. If you have a good relationship with someone, that should be able to help you out with that.
And I'll just add that there are resources online that show the extent of mapped wetlands, and they are notoriously inaccurate. So it's always good to have somebody that knows what a wetland is out on the ground actually looking at it.
Yeah, don't trust the Fish and Wildlife Service National Wetland Inventory Mapping. Okay, so equity, well, let me go through this. Don't let permits expire. If you do get an individual permit, make sure you either do the work or you get a permit extension, because if it expires, you got to start all over. And that's no fun. Equity in concrete, this shows you how old this tip is. The real point of this is get your work done as fast as you can. If you're going to be doing some disturbance, the sooner you get it done, the better, because you never know what's going to happen. Once you start that project, you're in better shape and you're not going to be subject to some potential either changes in regulations or whatever. You want to keep moving with your projects. Remember, resources can be dynamic. If your project sits for a while, you might want to take another quick look before you get going to make sure that you haven't gotten more wetlands or you have fewer wetlands, and make sure that you haven't had a bald eagle move in that you have to deal with all of a sudden, which is happening down on Cherry Creek. So build those relationships with your regulators. They really appreciate people talking and asking questions, and you really just need to have those open, transparent conversations with them and make sure you do what you say you're going to do. This goes back again to the communication about changes in the design. Keep your compliance specialist apprised so that they can keep the regulators up to date as well. And of course, be sure to include that compliance and permitting in the schedule. As you know, same with like clomers and loamers, it takes a long time if you're getting an individual permit. So we really need to be taking that into account. And just make sure you know what you need to know out there. We recommend doing the resource mapping or identification same time as when the surveyors are out there. Those resources are as much a part of your project conditions as your topographic mapping. You can't start without knowing that, in my opinion.
We are at time, but we do have one question that has come in, what are the chances of getting a meeting with the core Albuquerque district before submitting a PCN?
I don't know.
Last I heard, which I've been out of consulting for a little bit now, the Albuquerque district may not take pre-application meetings if you are pursuing a nationwide permit. That may have changed. I know that their staffing situation is pretty dynamic. They've had people leave and come. I think they've hired some people, but I don't know the current status of that office.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Yep.
I mean, I certainly, you should ask that
Right.
directly of them, to, especially if you have a concern. And we sometimes do meetings in person at the sometimes that helps them if it's not a field meeting. If you can even just meet them online or in person to just, talk to them about the project, that may be enough to meet your needs. Doesn't have to be a site visit for sure, because obviously that doubles or triples the time it takes. So.
And you could always ask. I mean, it doesn't hurt to ask them if you can have a meeting. So I would recommend asking.
My last little slide here is it's all about the zen of environmental compliance. It never gets easier. So you just have to take that deep breath and work through it. Yeah. Well, I think these slides are going to be made available. And I think there's a recording happening as well. So KristiLee and I are happy to answer any questions you have. So
Anytime.
So hopefully this has been helpful, and we really appreciate your listening, and we're always open for new suggestions on topics to cover with you guys, because we love working with you. So always looking for ways to make it better and more fun.
Yep.
Thanks so much to you both. This was very informative. At least for me, I'm sure lots of other people as well. So thanks for, taking the time and the effort to share your knowledge and your experience with us. We appreciate it.
It's our pleasure.
Happy to.
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, like Mary said, we are recording the meeting. We have recorded it, and the slides will be available. So we're going to wrap up the meeting now. I just want to, in parting, again, say that the CASFUM Outreach and Training Committee organized this lunch and learn, and this is part of what we do. We're an active committee, and we're always looking for new members. So if you're interested, our next meeting is going to be a happy hour meeting on May 15th, and we'll be sending out an announcement when we finalize the location. So please join us. All right, that's it. Thank you so much, guys.
All right, bye-bye.